Elden Ring is one of the best games I've ever played. 10 out of 10. Thanks for watching. Bye. Well, okay, maybe there's a bit more to be said. I've been playing Elden Ring obsessively since it came out, and actually I've got plenty to say about it. I'll be trying to steer clear of spoilers though, so all the footage you'll see is from a low-level character in the starting area. And despite the fact that I just awarded the game 10 out of 10, this isn't really a review. It's just some random thoughts about a game that I've spent pretty much every spare moment with in the last several weeks. And honestly, what would a 10 out of 10 score even mean? That a game is perfect? I think most people would agree that no such thing exists. And in fact, Elden Ring has many, I want to use the word flaws, but I'm not sure that's accurate. What it does have though is an abundance of moments where I found myself thinking, wow, I love this game, but I really wish they'd done this bit differently. Nevertheless, if I was a proper game reviewer and required to give Elden Ring a score, it would be a 10 out of 10, no doubt. There's just no other appropriate award for a game that absorbed me so completely and provided so many awesome moments. Let me start with a brief summary of my history with FromSoft games, which I think is relevant here because the Soulsborne series are unique beasts, and how the player approaches them is important. Actually, my FromSoft history starts with King's Field on the PS1, an amazing game in its time with many of the crucial Soulsborne design philosophies already in place. But man, that was a long time ago. Maybe I'll do a video on it one day. Anyway, coming forward a decade and a half, I played Demon's Souls on PlayStation 3 for a couple of hours, then gave up and never touched it again. I've played Dark Souls for maybe 100 hours over the years, but I've never actually got all that far, because every year or two I remember how much I love the world design, start a new game, and give up after a dozen or so hours once I remember how brutal it is. I've played Dark Souls 2 and 3 for a few hours each, but they've failed to draw me in. I've also played Sekiro for a few hours, and honestly I'm not sure I even have the potential to be skilled enough to make progress in that game. And then there's Bloodborne. Given my history with FromSoft games, I expected to bounce off it after a few hours, but I didn't. Instead, I fell in love. I completed it many times, I killed every boss including the ones in the expansion, it became my first ever Platinum trophy and possibly my favourite game on the PS4. So I approached Elden Ring with some trepidation, given that, statistically speaking, I was more likely to find it too frustrating and painful to endure than I was to fall in love all over again. I actually had no real intention of buying it at launch. I figured I'd probably wait until the inevitable Game of the Year edition if the reviews are any good. But as it turned out, the reviews were better than good. They were the epitome of universal acclaim. Plus, I heard the word accessible being thrown into the conversation, and that seemed encouraging. So I decided to take a risk and buy it right away. Who knows, I thought, maybe I'll like it as much as Bloodborne. Needless to say, I did, and then some. At time of writing, I've spent just over 100 hours with the game. It took me a little over 60 hours to roll the credits first time around, and another 40 or so to get all the achievements. Yes, like Bloodborne, I got the Platinum trophy, or whatever the Steam equivalent is since I was playing on PC. That means FromSoft games make up 2/3 of all the games I've ever bothered getting all the achievements in, the other being No Man's Sky, where you pretty much just get the Platinum by playing it. And actually, Bloodborne and Elden Ring are kind of the same in that respect. There are no incredibly tough or insanely irritating extra tasks you need to accomplish in order to get all the achievements. You just need to play the game extensively, kill a bunch of bosses, and find a bunch of items. If even a doofus like me can do it, pretty much anyone can. After my first couple of hours with Elden Ring, however, I was seriously doubting I'd ever be able to finish it, let alone get all the achievements. The game starts, like seemingly every FromSoft game, by throwing you almost immediately into an unwinnable boss fight. Well, unwinnable for me at least, and most players. I'm sure there are quite a few pros who manage to get it down, but either way, you need to die to start the proper game. It's a FromSoft tradition, and one that makes a lot of sense. These games are all about death, so you might as well start as you mean to go on. You arise from death in a dismal cave, and if you're like most people who have played this game, you probably failed to realise there's a combat tutorial if you jump down a nearby hole in the ground. The fact that the tutorial is so easy to miss has been a source of irritation for some people who claim it's bad game design. Personally, I'm not so sure. For one thing, it's amusing. For another, the prospect of missing something, the nagging feeling that you've left something behind, is crucial to the overall appeal of the game, even if that something is the tutorial. If the constant threat of missing something wasn't omnipresent, the compulsion to explore every inch of the vast game world would be weakened. And honestly, if you've ever played another FromSoft game, the tutorial isn't going to teach you much, and if you haven't, you'll be able to pick it up as you go along. As demanding as Elden Ring is, the fundamental gameplay is relatively straightforward. barring a few little quirks that aren't covered in the tutorial in any case. So you step out into the open air, talk to a mysterious NPC who gives you the vaguest hint of what's going on, and then you're pretty much left to your own devices. The only real guidance you get from this point on comes from the Sites of Grace, which serve as this game's version of Dark Souls bonfires, or Bloodborne's lanterns. These are basically checkpoints. When you die, you'll usually resurrect at the last grace you visited, and you can teleport freely between any grace you've discovered. Also, resting at a grace will completely heal you and refill your healing and mana flasks, but will also resurrect any non-boss enemy you've killed. This is incredibly fundamental stuff in FromSoft games, so I apologise for rehashing it, but I'm sure there's at least 5 or 6 people out there who haven't played a Dark Souls game before. Maybe even more, like 8 or 9 people. Anyway, what Elden Ring does that no other FromSoft game has done is give you a big glowing sign pointing to where you should go next. Well, it's not quite as simple as that, but many of these Sites of Grace will have a sparkling golden trail that will point you in the direction of, well, something. It won't necessarily be the simplest route through the game. In fact, it will most often be something that you don't actually need to do to complete the game at all. It'll just be something worthy of your attention. And of course, you're free to follow these golden trails or ignore them as you see fit. Me personally, I chose to follow them, with some minor deviations along the way. I encountered some enemies that I managed to dispatch without too many issues. I even found a mini-boss in a cave, which I also managed to kill after only a couple of attempts. Things I thought were going well. Maybe what I'd read about this game being more accessible to a wider audience was true. Then I got to what I assumed was the first proper boss, and I enjoyed fighting it, for a while. It's the type of boss I enjoy most in Souls games, fast-paced and intense, against a humanoid foe who, although large, is not so colossal as to make the player feel like a small dog, a Yorkshire Terrier maybe, scurrying between the enemy's legs and occasionally launching an attack on a nearby ankle. And of course I died many times. I did make some progress. After a good few attempts I managed to get the boss to its second phase, where he pulls out a giant golden hammer and starts seriously trying to smash you into the ground. But after half an hour I hadn't made much more progress than that. I certainly never came close to killing him, and that remained true for the next half hour as well. I felt like I'd hit a brick wall. No matter how careful I was, no matter how well I played, eventually he'd slam that hammer of his into the side of my head and I'd see those iconic inevitable words floating up at me. You died. I'm not going to say I was frustrated. I'd honestly enjoyed the fight, and it takes more than dying repeatedly for an hour to upset me. But I was a little concerned. Was this game going to be too much for me to handle? Was I going to be unable to experience what was by most accounts a masterpiece of a game due to my own ineptitude? It certainly seemed possible, if not likely. Maybe, relatively accessible as this new FromSoft game was, it still wasn't going to be accessible enough for a noob like me. But it definitely wasn't time to throw in the towel just yet. This was an open world game, and there was a hell of a lot more of it to explore. Maybe, somewhere out there, I'd find a challenge more suited to my modest skills. And maybe, once I'd done a bit of adventuring, I'd be able to come back to this boss, more experienced and with better gear, and manage to take him down. So I turned my back on the first boss and set off into the wilderness. And this for me is where the game truly started. Once I gave myself free rein to just go wherever I pleased and explore whatever I wanted, I began to realise just how finely crafted this world truly was. Every square metre of it seemed worthy of exploration, and every turn I took showed me something new that demanded my attention. The sense of freedom was incredible. There seemed to be no barriers, other than the ability of the world's monstrous inhabitants to smash me into an early but blessedly temporary grave. I explored to the east and found a land tainted with scarlet rot. I explored to the north and discovered that, contrary to expectations, there was actually a way to proceed in that direction without clearing out the castle and killing that first boss, which had thus far defeated me. I explored to the south and found another, smaller castle, overrun with foul beasts, at the end of which was a boss who proved to be a damn sight easier than the one to the north. In every direction I went, the world seemed to grow before me. The map kept on expanding, and what I had previously thought were the edges of the game world proved to be nothing of the sort. To be presented with such a realm, so vast and so densely packed with mysterious locales and dangerous denizens, seemed both intimidating and exhilarating. A dozen hours in, I was ready to call Elden Ring one of the best games I'd ever played. I was also ready, finally, to go back to that first boss and find out if the extra levels and gear I'd acquired would be enough to see me to victory. They were. In fact, they were more than enough. This time around, I killed him fairly easily. I mean, not super easily. I'm pretty sure he still killed me more times than he should have. But I prevailed after not too many attempts. After that, I got to explore the rest of the castle, which was the first of what I have heard called legacy dungeons. Basically what this means is a large, intricately designed and mostly enclosed area, essentially a more traditional Dark Souls style experience. There are only a few of these in Elden Ring, which has been the source of some complaint, and I have to admit, yeah, it would have been good to have a few more of them, but ultimately the open world is so fantastic and so vast that it feels a little ungrateful to think that way. Still, it would have been nice. At the end of the castle was, predictably, the lair of the second main boss, and I killed him on my first attempt, which was definitely not due to any skill on my part, but was more a testament to just how over-leveled I now was. And with those two bosses down, I finally felt confident that it was not going to be beyond my abilities to finish Elden Ring. It might take me a while, and I suspected I'd struggle a fair bit. In my time wandering around, I'd encountered more than one imposing boss that made me immediately nope out and seek friendlier pastures, but I was now fairly sure that, eventually, I'd be triumphant. And since I've already said that I finished the game and got all the achievements, it's fairly obvious that I was right. What I was wrong about was how much of a struggle it would be, because in the end it wasn't much of a struggle at all. There are a few reasons for this. First, as I've already mentioned, I was over-leveled. Second, I discovered a couple of abilities that were powerful to the point of being broken. And third, I pretty much ran away from anything that might oppose the challenge. So, let's talk about the difficulty of Elden Ring. It's a complicated subject, and my opinions on it are likewise complicated, not to mention a little ambivalent. Before I played Bloodborne, I would have said that the Dark Souls games should absolutely, unequivocally have had difficulty settings. I really wanted to love them, but I found the frustration of them eventually outweighed any pleasure I got from them. And this problem was frustrating in itself because I was convinced that it could have been solved so easily. Just give us noobs an easy mode. It wouldn't take much, I thought. Just halve damage taken, double damage done, and boom, you've got a game that would have been manageable to people like me. And it would be just as enjoyable, nothing about it would have changed, the combat, the exploration, the whole game experience would be the same, there'd just be a much more workable margin of error. And for the people who wanted to get good, they could just play the normal mode. Who could have a problem with that? Well, a lot of people, obviously. It's still a form of heresy in some circles to say that Souls games should have difficulty settings. Me, personally, well, I don't consider the issue to be as unequivocal as I once did, and that's down to Bloodborne. As I've said, I love Bloodborne. I devoured it. Getting the Platinum Trophy was one of the most enjoyable and satisfying single-player experiences of my gaming life. And once I'd done that, I knew for sure that it would have been nowhere near as satisfying or enjoyable if it had been easier. In fact, I might not have bothered to get the Platinum at all. And honestly, this was a new experience for me. I'd never been someone who considered challenge to be a necessary or even beneficial element of a game. And I still don't consider it necessary. I play games for a lot of reasons, but a desire for challenge is rarely one of them. I find real life challenging enough, I don't need it in games. But with Bloodborne, there's just no denying that I would not have experienced that same thrill when I killed the Orphan of Kos if it had taken me 5 attempts instead of 50. But okay, would difficulty settings in Bloodborne have been a bad thing? I was advocating for difficulty settings beforehand, so couldn't I in this case have just been someone who got good while the noobs debased themselves with the easy mode? Well, theoretically yes, but the fact is I would have just defaulted straight to the easy mode myself. That's just my modus operandi. And I would no doubt have still enjoyed Bloodborne, but I definitely would not have enjoyed it as much. And then there's Elden Ring. It was touted as being one of the most accessible FromSoft games yet, but there's still no difficulty settings. Except yes, in a sense, there are. The thing is, Elden Ring may be the hardest FromSoft game ever, or the easiest. It comes down to that self-proclaimed accessibility and how much of it players choose to exploit. I use the word exploit advisedly because in some ways, if you choose to play Elden Ring in the easiest ways possible, it really can feel like exploiting. Yet these are conscious design choices made by the developers. And I personally have made extensive use of them. It may even be true to say that I would never have finished the game without these design choices. But that doesn't mean that I consider them to be good choices. And this is because, while they make the game more accessible, they don't necessarily make it more fun to play. In some ways, I think they make the game less fun. Perhaps the most significant of these is the inclusion of Spirit Ashes. These allow you to summon spectral allies to assist you in almost every major fight you'll come across. There's quite a large variety of them, almost all of them being versions of enemies present in the game, and a couple of them are so insanely useful they can trivialise some fights. relatively speaking at least. Unless you're using real genuine exploits, there aren't really any boss fights in Elden Ring where it's not entirely possible to be demolished by your opponent in seconds if you lose concentration or make an unwise decision, but spirit summons eliminate a lot of the opportunities for this to happen. They do this directly by making enemies more likely to attack them than you, and indirectly by giving you more opportunities to be more aggressive and do damage, thus shortening the length of the fight. Using these summons makes the game a completely different experience, a less engaging and demanding one, and therefore a less enjoyable one. So why not just not use them? Well, sure, that's a valid option, and one that many players have chosen. So maybe spirit summons aren't a big deal. How about over-leveling then? The game makes it pretty easy to do so. There are several spots where you can farm runes, the currency required to level up, efficiently and effectively. And there's one particular spot where it's just incredibly quick and simple to get enough runes to level up to your heart's content. And this is a spot that's accessible relatively early on, if you know how to get to it. I personally didn't know how to get to it, at least not until after I'd finished the game and started to look up guides and forums for all the stuff I'd missed, but in a way it's just as much of a game changer as the spirit summons. And then there are all the overpowered, or some might say cheap, weapons and abilities you can acquire. As mentioned, I found one particular ability quite early in my playthrough that turned out to be massively useful right through to the last boss and beyond. And that was far from the only game-breakingly effective ability in the game, it was just the one I happened to discover. Incidentally, FromSoft seemed to agree with me on the game-breakingness of this ability, as it was nerfed after not very long at all. And to top it all off, there's the fact that you can run past pretty much every non-essential boss fight in the game. You have a mount in Elden Ring and it moves quickly, plus it takes damage on your behalf when you get hit. A powerful attack will knock you off your mount, but mostly these are easily avoidable. So I ended up spending a hell of a lot of time running blindly through dangerous areas filled with lethal foes, scrambling to find a site of grace and therefore a checkpoint. I died occasionally when I inadvertently stumbled into a dead end or literally ran into a deadly foe, but death is hardly a major mishap in a Souls game. This is especially true in Elden Ring, where checkpoints are very generously scattered about. In some places you can barely take 20 steps without falling over another one. So these are the major factors that make Elden Ring the most accessible FromSoft game thus far, and in many ways I'm grateful for them. I might not have made much progress at all without them, but I do believe they weaken the overall game experience and that better design choices could have been made. For instance, the fact that you can easily just run past most enemies makes their presence seem almost pointless. Fighting minor enemies out in the world isn't exactly the most fun you can have in the game, so if you don't need to kill them for runes or items and you can just dash past them on your horse to grab the items they're guarding, no need to dismount by the way, what really is their purpose? They make the world seem more alive and more dangerous, but once you realise they're not really dangerous at all, they start to seem a little forlorn. And the few that are dangerous, which are typically the ones that can launch an arrow into your cerebellum with perfect accuracy from hundreds of meters away, start to seem like unbalanced irritants by comparison. Ultimately, there are a few good reasons to engage with most enemies, which is a shame, because their character designs are really rather cool, and from a visual and tonal perspective they add a lot to the game world, they just don't add much to the gameplay. Plus, of course, there's what might be considered the ultimate way to make the game easier, summoning real human players to come help you out. Personally, that's not something I've ever done. Anyway, I really do think it's accurate to say that Elden Ring has an easy mode, it's just that you select it by making choices within the game, rather than by pressing a button on the title screen. And unlike the sort of easy mode you choose at the start of the game, not too many people really have a problem with this. Sure, decent players may scoff and roll their eyes at players who elect to use spirit summons, or who use only the cheesiest of weapons and abilities, but they don't seem to consider the inclusion of such things as some sort of profound moral transgression. Whereas, if you even lightly suggest that maybe proper difficulty settings wouldn't be such a bad thing in a Souls game, the fury of 100,000 get-gooders will rain down upon your unsuspecting head. So it is with an umbrella at the ready that I say yes, despite everything, I think Elden Ring should have difficulty settings. I'm basing this solely on my own preferences and experiences with the game. I don't care how other people play, and I don't understand people who do care, although clearly they are numerous. All that matters is whether you're enjoying your experience, and if the ways in which other people find their enjoyment affects your enjoyment, that's your problem, not theirs. You might remember that I admitted earlier I would not have enjoyed Bloodborne as much if I had played it on a theoretical easy mode, but Bloodborne was a different beast. It was in some ways a more balanced game with a smoother difficulty curve. Also, I actually think the boss encounters in Bloodborne were better designed, in gameplay terms at least, and more rewarding and intuitive to fight, but that's a topic for another day. The thing is, every way I've mentioned for making Elden Ring easier diminishes the game in ways that simply retuning damage numbers for an easy mode wouldn't. It's just not as fun to hide behind a spirit summon or spam an overpowered attack as it is to properly engage with the combat. I agree with the Git Gooders on that score. What I don't agree with is the notion that properly engaging with the game should be the sole province of those who are actually good at it. Yes, it's fine that games reward you for skill, but enjoyment of the game should not be one of those rewards. Of course, I've made it pretty clear that I enjoyed Elden Ring regardless. I mean, yeah, holy crap did I enjoy it. But I could have enjoyed it more with a few simple adjustments, and that's one reason why I'm so ambivalent about the whole 10 out of 10 thing. There's one other somewhat common complaint, however, that I definitely disagree with, and that's the problem some people have with the incredibly vague quest system. You might have seen the tweet from someone who worked on Horizon Forbidden West criticising the quest design in Elden Ring. I found that pretty disappointing, largely because I love the Horizon games and have a huge amount of respect for the people who created them. But in terms of quest design, you could barely find two more different open world games. Horizon has your standard quest structure with clearly marked quest givers, a map that shows you basically where you need to go, and similarly clearly delineated conclusions to the quests. Elden Ring, on the other hand, has quest givers whose existence you could easily fail to discover, whose motives and desires are obtuse, and who, even if you did manage to find them in the first place, might randomly bugger off to somewhere else that you might also never discover. Both of these approaches are valid, and it's Horizon's quest design that can more readily be described as textbook good design, but which approach is more likely to encourage the player to actively, organically explore the world in fascinating and compelling ways? It sure isn't Horizon, and perhaps that's why textbooks are rarely described as fascinating and compelling. Well, there's plenty more to be said about Elden Ring, but it's tough to do so without going more deeply into specifics than I want to at this point. I may one day do a more thorough analysis with full spoilers, but I've at least covered the main elements, the good and the questionable, that most stood out to me in my time with the game. So yeah, call it a 10 out of 10 or whatever numerical scale seems most appropriate, but in the end I'm just happy to call it one of the best games I've ever played. For now though, get off my lawn.